and welcome once again to the Sirius report. This is Paul from the Sirius report, and this is another Ukraine briefing. Now, I want to start off making the point that quite often, and we've seen this for getting on for 3 years, statements made that have no substance to them. There are statements that are impossible to prove or, for that matter, disprove. And I increasingly keep seeing statements that the United States wants to escalate the war, the United States is going to continue to push for NATO forces to enter Ukraine, etc., etc. And this could not be any further from the truth. The United States has wanted out of this war for a very long time, but getting out of the war is not that easy to do, simply because they've invested so much political capital and money, time and effort to support Ukraine. To walk away from it can be very problematic and basically career suicide for people. Not so much in the Biden administration who are walking out the door anyway, but people in the military, etc., who then have to justify, well, why have you walked away at this point in time? Are you admitting, therefore, Russia has won the war and Ukraine is defeated? And they can't do that. And the reasons are very obvious. Another point worth making with regards to this, and we've said this previously, pretty much every day for getting on for 3 years, the United States is always on the phone to the Russians going, look, you know, we're making statements in the media. We just have to make statements. We have to sound tough. We have to look like we mean things we don't mean because, you know, remember, we have to, in the eyes of the West, still look like a superpower. But remember, we're doing everything to not escalate this conflict to an all-out war between us, meaning the United States and Russia. This is a very important point that I rarely see made, and it's proven to be the case for 3 years. There's been countless occasions where something could have escalated and the United States has done everything to tell the Russians, look, we don't agree with this. No, this wasn't down to us. No, this didn't happen. And reassuring, the Russians that they have no intention of wanting to escalate the conflict to a direct war with Russia, because that therefore would end up being World War III, which neither the Russians nor the United States or anyone else want, for that matter, no matter how harebrained elements might be within the US administration. That has never been the case. Now I want to move on, because I've been asked a few people to comment on this Zelenskyy Lex Fridman interview. Frankly, I don't think most of it was worth even listening to. This is only an opinion, of course. Some people will think to the contrary. But there are some points in the interview I think worth referring to, even if it's just to dismiss them as being irrelevant or simply something that never happened. Now, one thing Zelenskyy made in this interview, a point, was that Ukraine will be ready to hold negotiations, apparently with the United States and other European countries, on settlements of the conflict in late January. This would have been after, of course, Trump's inauguration on January the 20th. Now, Fridman said during the conversation he'd like to see the agreement on the conflict settlement in Ukraine to be reached. And absolutely, of course, the sooner that happens, the better. And, you know, therefore, the inauguration of Trump, who's repeatedly said he was going to reach the settlement immediately after he was made president, might seem logical. But again, this is on this assumption that somehow the West and Ukraine are going to dictate terms and tell Russia how this war ends when Russia is clearly winning the war. And there was an interesting statement by Zelenskyy, which if he believes, is wholly inaccurate. And that is that Putin is afraid of Trump. So Zelenskyy therefore clearly imagines that if Trump and Ukraine and European countries come up with their plan to end the war, which of course Russia is never going to entertain, that somehow because Putin is afraid of Trump, he's going to cave into those demands and go, yes, of course, we'll accept you later on to have NATO membership in 20 or 30 years. Yes, we will accept freezing the conflict in territory we now regard as being the Russian Federation. Yes, you can continue to provide arms to Ukraine, and all the things, of course, that Russia is explicitly stated are simply not the case. So Zelensky is perfectly entitled to believe this, but if he does, he's going to be in for a bit of a rude awakening when the reality comes out that Russia is not interested in making an agreement based upon the fact that the losing party thinks they're in a position to dictate the terms of how the war should end. Another point worth making is Zelensky thinks that the United States can provide strong security guarantees. Well, it depends what that means. And apparently because of that, then, together with the European Union, we can go with some tough negotiating position, and we can talk to the Russians on that basis. So he thinks he's got safety in numbers, and that will allow him to then somehow, as the defeated party, dictate the terms. Again, this is nonsense. He also made the point that Putin wants to regain control of post-Soviet countries. And of course, this is nonsense. This is the statement that's been made prior to the Ukraine war, that somehow he wants the Soviet Union 2.0. Absolute nonsense. Perhaps Zelensky genuinely believes this. I think there are elements, say, in the Baltic Republic who believe this also. But for what purpose? Why would he possibly want those countries? They're of absolutely no use or value whatsoever to Russia. This is not, again, Russia of the 1980s or the 70s or the 60s. Russia is a very different country, and it's not interested in resurrecting the Soviet Union. Zelensky also made this claim that Lukashenko apologized by phone during the first days of the war for allowing attacks from the Belarusian territory. Apparently, Lukashenko's come out and said, "I never said anything of the sort." Another point worth making is, and it's all these claims about North Korea's involvement in the war, which no one's been able to prove anything. And Zelensky is now claiming that this poses a risk to the Pacific region, particularly to Japan and South Korea. Well, it doesn't in the slightest. What does something going on in Russia, even if it was true, have anything to do with Northeast Asia, thousands of miles away? It's just nonsense. He also said he thinks removing Russian energy from the market aligns with the interests of all reasonable people. Well, it might align with reasonable people from his perspective in the West, but as we've seen, the West knows it needs Russian energy, and that's why they're trying all manner to get Russian energy. If it's not pipeline gas, they want LNG. I mean, just look at Spain. In 2024, the second largest provider of LNG to Spain was Russia, and that accounted for about 21% of Spain's overall LNG imports. And that's just one example amongst many. In reality, European countries need Russian energy one way or the other, although of course if they buy LNG it's a lot more expensive. And pipeline gas, which of course has largely been curtailed either because of the blowing up of Nord Stream or because Ukraine has prevented transit via pipelines across its territory. He then made an interesting point where he talked, Zelensky, about Ukraine is trying to fight corruption and how everyone was profiting from the war except Ukraine. And he said those who profited from the war, we found them and slapped their hands. I think that's just a translation either from Ukrainian or Russian into English. Now, there's been a lot of contention about corruption. He did make, I think, a point that quite a lot of money that's earmarked for Ukraine never got there. I can imagine that's true. Quite who's responsible for corruption and stealing money is debatable, but I don't doubt it's happened from the Western side of the equation, but also from Ukraine itself. One point that was interesting that Zelensky made, I think this is something I have some partial agreement with him on. He used quite sort of fruity language in describing the failure of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which, of course, Ukraine agreed to give up nuclear weapons that it obviously inherited from the Soviet Union, which was in return for assurances of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now he's claiming, based on the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, that these self-same countries should have come to Ukraine's aid when Russia invaded the country, and its territorial integrity was therefore compromised, on that basis. And to some extent, I have some sympathy with him in that regard, but it proves once again, when push comes to pull, the United States and other countries are not going to lock horns with a nuclear power like Russia, so these treaties become meaningless because, the United States only goes to war with countries that can't defend themselves, certainly not countries who have nuclear weapons. He rightly said, to some degree, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum under pressure from Russia and the United States. That's true. He did make a very strange comment when Fridman suggested that Putin loved his people. He said, "You're mistaken, he doesn't." Well, of course he loves his people, but his excuse was, you cannot send your people to another land knowing that they will die. Well, if we take that literally, the inference of that is, why did Zelensky send all his forces to Kursk, which was a completely futile exercise and ended up creating another meat grinder? Over 55,000 Ukrainians have now died. Kursk is part of the Russian territory, so he sent them to another land, surely knowing they would die. So it's hypocrisy, and it's a very weak explanation for why Putin doesn't love his people. Of course he does, and the Russian people know this, and he's probably, however you want to characterize Putin, it's one thing he does, and he holds the people in his nation in very high regard, and that's frankly something we don't see with Western politicians. And now we're going to move on to some revelations from Western sources, because increasingly the West notes that Ukraine has a rapidly reduced capability to withstand Russian forces and is now not ruling out the collapse of Ukraine's army defences soon, meaning in some cases weeks, perhaps months. The outgoing Biden administration is trying to avoid this scenario and talks about, we're going to keep delivering sophisticated weapons, including these so-called longer-range missiles that have been a complete failure, like every other game changer given to the Ukrainians. But the White House has admitted that supplying the Ukrainian army with material only is not sufficient to stabilise the front line. As we know, the Ukrainian authorities are looking to lower the mobilisation age to 18. That should be adopted shortly, and that was based on a recommendation by Washington itself. Outrageous, should never happen. And of course, the problem with this, apart from sending 18-year-olds to the front line with no military training and poorly equipped, is now Eastern European countries are expecting huge amounts of more Ukrainian refugees trying to leave, obviously, the country and head to their countries. Currently, men aged 25 to 60 are subject to mobilisation in Ukraine. I mean, putting 50, 60-year-olds, even 45-year-olds being mobilised is outrageous. But the idea you're going to put 18-year-olds is equally outrageous. And I know people say, well, they did this in previous wars. Well, that doesn't make it right. It doesn't matter whether we had 18-year-olds sent in World War II or not. The world's a different place. We should not be sending 18-year-olds anywhere on that basis. But this is because of desperation amongst the ranks of the Ukrainians in terms of the numbers they've got left, because they've suffered such huge losses in the process. Another revelation worth mentioning is Blinken has come out and admitted that the US began supplying weapons to Ukraine well before the special military operation started. He said, we made sure that well before it happened, starting in September of obviously 2021, and then again in December, we quietly sent a lot of weapons to Ukraine, including things like Stingers and Javelins. So why were they doing this? Was it because they seriously thought at that stage that Russia was going to invade, or was it a part of a desire for a preemptive strike on Donbass itself? Well, we won't ever really understand the answer to that, but it's quite often interesting how when people like Blinken leave office, they suddenly start admitting the truth about things that were either previously never discussed or may actually have been denied. Another point worth making is the US authorities have also made an admission that things like the ATACMS, F-16 planes and Abrams were frankly just not game changers. They've done nothing to change the situation on the battlefield for Kiev itself, and it's not yielded any gains anywhere. Also, they said that the most part of all these promised weapons, meaning the majority, have already been delivered, with a very small number remaining to be delivered to Ukraine. They're, of course, going to come out and say Kiev's stockpile of weapons is in a healthy position. Well, it's not. They're basically running out of everything, making it impossible for them to, in any way, shape or form, adequately defend themselves, let alone farcical situations like some supposed Kursk offensive, which was all over in a matter of hours and resulted in huge amounts of Ukrainians dying as a result of such a stupid act. Another point worth making with regards to the attack, and remember all the claims this will start World War III, the Russians are going to respond very aggressively with nuclear weapons. Well, ATACMS still keep being fired. No one's talking about it. No one's interested. The Russians aren't. The West's embarrassed to talk about it because, they fire them into the Belgorod region, for example, and they're all shot down by Russian S-400s and Panzer air defense systems. And this is a regular occurrence, and it's got to the point no one cares anymore. It's like, well, so what? So again, all these exaggerated claims that are made in the mainstream media and the alt media by people claiming to understand what was going on in the context of the war, as we said all along were nonsensical, have proved again to be nonsensical. And I think it's one of those situations as ever, and it's something we've said for a very long time: be informed, not entertained. There's too much entertainment going on with respect to this war, and it's about time after 3 years this ended. The reality is Ukraine can't possibly win the war. This has been known or admitted in the West for quite some time. From our perspective, the argument's always been, how was it ever possible to do so, given the simple fact Russia's a nuclear power with the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and if they were really felt threatened, and from a perspective that, this threat could actually collapse Russia itself, they would undoubtedly have responded with nuclear weapons with devastating consequences for Ukraine and then potentially in a broader sense. So that was never going to be a possibility that Ukraine could win. And it comes back to the point, as I've said all along, the United States wants a way out of this because it's acutely embarrassed by the fact that all its game-changing military hardware has proved to be useless. Tactically, it's proved to be useless. It's spent huge sums of money on a fruitless, pointless exercise and sadly resulted in the death, arguably up to now, 1 million Ukrainians, with probably 1 million also injured in the process, to the point that they are never going to be going back to the battlefield again. And never mind what it's done to the country itself in destroying it. And of course, these are situations where there is no way the United States can wriggle out of this. They will try, of course, sell ridiculous ideas how Ukraine didn't lose the war and that Russia suffered strategic defeats. But there are people whose very careers could be hanging on the line from this. So the question is, what happens when Trump comes in? He promised to end the war in 24 hours. That's not going to happen. But we'll see what happens next with regards to developments in a Trump world, which will happen from the 20th of January, following his inauguration on that date. And I think that's a good point to stop today. What I would like to say is thank you for all your ongoing support. Please like, share, subscribe, spread the word. I know a lot of people are very impressed with what we've done, and we'd like to continue to grow the channel so people can indeed be informed and not entertained. And with that, I will say goodbye.